Good evening, everyone. Tonight, I want you to settle in, turn down the lights, and listen closely. What you are about to hear is not a ghost story. Not exactly. It's older than that. It's a story whispered in smoke, carved into stone, and buried beneath the bones of a continent. Long before this land had borders or maces, there were wars here, wars so ancient that the wind itself seems to remember them. Some were fought between tribes, others between men, and something that looked like men, only larger, hungrier, and far less human. Across centuries, through desert heat and mountain cold, the same tale keeps returning. Spanish soldiers digging under a mission in California. Delaware scouts crossing a misted river. Warriors hiding in caverns to escape a race of pale giants. Archaeologists brushing dust from bones that should not exist. Each time the story resurfaces, it carries the same echoing warning from the past that refuses to die. These are the forgotten wars of the Americas, the quiet struggle between our ancestors and the beings they called the man-eaters, the sky-born, the red-haired giants. Some call them myth. Others say their remains lie beneath our feet. But whether legend or truth, their shadows still stretch across the land. So take a deep breath. Let the sound of the storm outside fade, and follow the voice that rises from the earth itself. This is the war against the Cannibal Giants. A journey through 30 fragments of history, fear, and remembrance. You may not believe every word, but by the end, you will understand why every culture that met the giants also tried to forget them. The heat had been unbearable that morning. The air above the California plain shimmered as if the whole world was breathing slow and heavy. Under the burning sun, a handful of soldiers worked beside the half-built wall of a Franciscan mission. They had come here to dig a storage pit for powder and ammunition. None of them expected to uncover anything other than clay and sweat. Manuel Cavo, a corporal with a weathered face and eyes bleached pale by dust, drove his shovel deep into the ground. The metal struck something hard. The sound was not the dull thud of rock. It was a hollow ring, faint but wrong. He froze, resting both hands on the handle, listening for the echo that did not come. The others gathered around, their boots sinking into the dirt. They widened the hole, scraping through layers of gravel packed tight by centuries. What rose from the earth was a shape too even to be natural. It was a box, or maybe a coffin, buried in a bed of crushed stone. The lid glimmered with a strange gray sheen like old iron, but not quite metal. Manuel whispered that it looked older than the mission itself, older than the land. Sweat rolled from his chin and left a trail on the surface. The earth smelled sweet and dry like a burnt wood long forgotten. The men stood silent, waiting for someone to decide whether to open it. Finally, Manuel nodded. The picks came down. It took them half the day. When the lid shifted, the air changed. A faint gust rose from the crack, cold and stale. Beneath it lay the remains of a man stretched the full length of the box, a shape that dwarfed them all. His frame filled every corner, limbs long and pale, skull huge enough to cradle a helmet twice the size of theirs. Around the bones lay tools of stone and thin plates of carved shell. On one piece, faint symbols curved like the loops of old script. None of the soldiers spoke. Manuel counted the teeth and stopped. There were 2 full rows above and below. He stepped back, his throat dry. The young digger beside him crossed himself and whispered a prayer meant for the living. They wrapped the skeleton again, but the image clung to them like the scent of the grave. When dusk came, the men carried their discovery to the padre of the mission. The old priest listened without a word. He told them to summon the Chumash elders from the nearby village. By the time the visitors arrived, the sky was red over the hills. The elders looked down into the open pit and fell to their knees. Their voices trembled as they spoke of ancient beings called the Ali Giwi, who once ruled lands far to the east before wars drove them here. The priest understood little of their tongue, but the fear in their eyes told him enough. This place, they said, was sacred. To disturb the sleeping one was to invite misfortune upon the valley. The father crossed himself again and ordered the grave sealed. That night, Manuel could not sleep. The candle flickered against the cracked wall of the barracks, painting shadows that seemed to twist on their own. He thought about the strange teeth, the carved shells, the chill that rose from the coffin as if the earth had exhaled after centuries. Outside, coyotes howled across the dry field. Somewhere beneath that same ground, a giant slept again, hidden from sight, but not from memory. Manuel wondered whether the elders had been right to be afraid. He promised himself that in the morning he would return to the pit and see if in his hand he held a carved shell that glowed faintly in the firelight. He said the thing they had unearthed was not a man, not as men are now. It was one of the Ali Giwi, the ancient people who walked when the mountains were still young. Manuel watched the old man's lips move, his words translated by a young boy who spoke halting Spanish. The Ali Giwi, Tomol said, came from the river of the east, taller than the tallest tree, their eyes pale as the morning sun. They ruled the valleys and the rivers, building stone walls that touched the sky. But they grew proud, cruel, and hungry. When their wars began, the rivers turned bitter, and their own kin rose against them. Many were slain. Others fled west until they found the ocean and could run no farther. Here they buried their dead and swung to the earth to hold them fast. That coffin, he said, was one of the last. The old man's voice wavered. He spoke of a time when the ground shook for 3 days, when the sea climbed the cliffs to swallow the broken forts. The Ali Giwi had called the storm down upon themselves. Their dead were sealed not to honor them, but to contain them. The fires around the circle hissed and snapped, scattering sparks like fireflies. Manuel felt the sound travel through his bones. He had fought men, seen villages burn, but this was different. It was not the fear of enemies made of flesh. It was the fear that the world itself remembered more than it should. The priest beside Mosiev whispered that the story was pagan superstition, but his voice trembled. The elder lifted the shell once more, showing the faint lines carved upon it. They were not decorations, he said. They were prayers, commands to keep what sleeps from rising. He asked that the soldiers return the grave to silence and never again touch the relics. Manuel nodded. He did not know if he believed in giants, but he knew the feeling of something watching from below. When the ceremony ended, the villagers scattered into the dark. Manuel lingered by the fire, staring at the dying embers. The wind carried the scent of the ocean, and something faint beneath it, a trace of dry earth and metal. He thought he heard the low hum again, the same sound that had come from the coffin's seal. It faded into the surf like a sigh. He turned toward the hills where the mission cross gleamed against the stars. He wondered if men had always built their faith on top of graves they did not understand. Behind him, the elder began another chant, softer now, a farewell to the spirit of the buried one. Each word seemed to press against the air until it felt thick and heavy. Manuel took one step back toward the mission path. The sea murmured behind him, steady and endless. The world felt older than it had that morning. He knew the sound of shovels would never again seem simple. Morning mist hung low over the Pennsylvania woods, turning the branches into gray ghosts. John Heckewelder, missionary and chronicler, sat beside the campfire with ink frozen at the tip of his quill. Before him, 3 Delaware elders waited, wrapped in fur cloaks. Their faces were steady, their eyes unreadable. He had come to learn their customs, But what they told him that day would outlast any sermon he could ever write. One elder leaned forward, his voice a steady drumbeat beneath the wind. He spoke of a time when the Delaware were not yet here, when their ancestors crossed from the western plains and met a nation of giants who ruled the river valleys. Heckewelder listened carefully. He had written about many tribes, but this tale was unlike the others. The giants were called Allegui. They built walls of earth that still scarred the land, mounds stretching for miles along the riverbanks. They guarded their cities with stone axes the size of a man's arm. When the Delaware first came east, they sent a messenger asking to share the river. The giants refused. Still, the Delaware began to cross, thousands of them wading through the cold water. The Allegui struck without warning. The river turned dark that day, and the Delaware fled back to their western shore. The elder's voice hardened as he spoke of what followed. Another tribe, the Mengwe, offered to join the Delaware in war. Together they built bows from ash, spears tipped with flint. They swore to drive the giants from the land or die trying. The missionary's hand trembled as he wrote. He could almost see it. The mounds lit by torches, the roaring of giants falling like trees. He felt a strange shame that his own people's history seemed smaller beside the vastness of this memory. As the story unfolded, the Delaware won battle after battle, though many perished. The giants, proud and pale, fortified their last city. The allied tribes surrounded it. When dawn came, the earth shook beneath their march. No one counted how many died, only that, when the smoke cleared, the Allegui were gone. They fled down the river, southward, and were never seen again. The old man's eyes glowed in the firelight. He said the land still carried their bones, buried under every mound the settlers mistook for ancient temples. Heckewelder felt the weight of the story settle over him. He was a man of scripture, yet this sounded older than any book he had ever read. He looked around at the quiet forest, the fog creeping between trunks like restless breath. For the first time he wondered whether the great battles of faith and conquest were only echoes of wars long forgotten. He closed his journal, its pages damp with dew, and promised to preserve the tale exactly as told. The Delaware called their river Alleguipo, River of the Giants. Even as the elder's voice faded, that name seemed to thrum beneath the soil. That night, the missionary dreamt of towering silhouettes moving across the horizon, their footfalls shaking the trees. In the dream, one turned toward him, its face pale and distant, its eyes full of a sorrow deeper than rage. When he woke, the fire was out and the forest silent, but the earth beneath him still felt warm, as if something massive had passed just moments before. The morning broke over the water in a wash of silver light. Mist drifted along the broad current, thick enough to hide the opposite bank. The Delaware scouts moved in silence, canoes gliding through the fog like dark leaves. Each man watched the shoreline ahead, where rumor said the giants had their fortress. The river whispered beneath them, carrying fragments of ice and old ash. At the prow, a young scout named Towin waited for a sign. He had been chosen for his sharp eyes and steadier heart. Yet as the mist parted, he wished he had neither. On the far shore stood shapes that did not belong to any world he knew. They were men, but larger, their heads level with the low trees, their hair a strange pale red that caught the light. One leaned upon a spear longer than a canoe. Another lifted a stone hammer that glimmered with carved symbols. The scouts froze. The giants moved slowly, their voices carrying over the water in a language that rolled like thunder. Towin gripped the bow in his lap, knowing it was useless. The eldest among them whispered that they should turn back. But behind them lay thousands waiting to cross. The river was the line between their old hunger and the promise of new land. A cry rang out. It might have been warning, might have been command. Arrows cut through the mist. One struck a giant's shoulder. The creature barely flinched. It turned, raised its weapon, and the world broke open. Stones flew across the water, smashing through wood and bone alike. The current turned red as men fell from their boats. Tawain paddled furiously, feeling the spray of shattered wood on his skin. The river swallowed screams until only the rush of water remained. When he reached the western bank, he collapsed, gasping, the sound of war pounding in his chest. That night, the survivors gathered around a fire that refused to burn steady. The air stank of wet ash. Chiefs argued whether to retreat or fight. One elder said that if they fled now, their children would never have land to call their own. Another said that to challenge such beings was to mock the spirits. But anger travels faster than fear. Tawain watched as the warriors sharpened their spears and spoke of vengeance. He could still see the giant who had looked straight into him from across the river, its face both human and something else. He wondered if the creature had seen fear or pity in his eyes. Before dawn, the chiefs met in silence. They decided to summon the Mengwe tribe to join them. Together they would cross again, not as scouts, but as an army. Tawain was told to guide them when the moon next rose full. He nodded, though the thought hollowed him. The river outside the camp steamed in the cold. It looked peaceful, like nothing had happened. But beneath that calm, he could hear the current murmuring the names of those who had drowned. When the mist lifted, the opposite bank was empty. The giants had vanished into the trees. Only a single mound of fresh earth marked where they had stood. On its peak lay a broken spearhead of stone, glinting faintly in the morning light. Tawain picked it up. The surface felt warm, almost alive. He tucked it into his belt, knowing that when the tribes returned, they would not come as guests. He glanced once more across the river and thought he saw a shape watching from the forest edge, tall and still. Then the wind shifted and the vision was gone, leaving only the endless whisper of the river that divided men from myths. The call went out through the forests and valleys, carried by runners with painted faces and by rums that spoke across the hills. From every distant camp, the Delaware and the Mengwe gathered, two nations bound not by trust, but by the memory of what they had lost. They met at the river where the mists never lifted, the same place where the scouts had fallen. By dusk, the shoreline flickered with hundreds of fires, and the scent of smoke mingled with fear. Tawain stood among them, clutching the stone spearhead he had taken from the far bank. The elders said it was a token of challenge. To him, it felt more like a curse that pulsed faintly in his palm. The giants were already waiting. On the opposite shore, their torches burned blue against the night. The shapes that moved between them seemed too tall, too slow, their shadows dragging far across the water. When the wind shifted, the tribes could hear the giants chanting in a low rumble that vibrated in their ribs. It was a sound older than language, a sound that made the firelight stutter. The chiefs gave the signal at dawn. Hundreds of canoes pushed into the current, paddles slicing the mist. The War of Thousands had begun. The first exchange was silent. Arrows hissed through the air, vanishing into fog. Then came the roar of stones, thrown from the opposite side, smashing through boats and men. The river turned into chaos. Yet the allied tribes pressed forward, leaping into the shallows and rushing the bank. Tawain stumbled onto wet earth and felt the ground quake under his feet. Ahead of him, a giant swung a club carved from tree trunk. The impact tore the breath from the air. Arrows rattled harmlessly against its chest. Only when a spear pierced the creature's thigh did it fall, dragging 3 men down beneath it. The screams were brief, cut off by mud and water. The battle raged for hours. The sun climbed and vanished behind smoke. The Delaware and Mengwe fought in waves, climbing over bodies, their chants rising in answer to the thunder of their enemies. Tawain moved like a shadow, slashing, dodging, praying without words. He saw one of the giants stumble, clutching its side, and in its fall, the trees shuddered as though struck by storm. When the final horn sounded, the ground was littered with broken spears and shattered shields. The giants had retreated deeper into the woods, leaving behind the echo of their steps. That night, the survivors built no fires. The river reflected the stars as if nothing had happened. The chiefs spoke quietly, deciding to pursue the giants before they could regroup. Tawain lay on the ground staring at the ski. Every sound felt too close. The breathing of his brothers, the slow crawl of the water, the soft crack of branches somewhere beyond the light. He remembered the elders' warning that these beings were not meant to be hunted. They were meant to be left alone, sealed within their own dying world. But war leaves no room for warnings. When dawn came again, the men crossed the river once more, their steps heavier. The forest swallowed them. Behind them, the river kept whispering, dragging away blood and ash in its endless current. Tawain turned once, thinking he saw movement in the mist, a single towering figure watching from afar, its eyes faint and sorrowful. Then it was gone, and the war moved forward into the unknown. Days turned into weeks. The forest ahead stretched like a wound that refused to close. The Delaware and Mengwe followed the tracks of their enemies through valleys blackened by fire and along riverbanks marked by prints so deep they filled with water. The giants no longer fought. They moved ahead in silence, burning their own settlements before leaving them behind. The smell of ash followed the tribes like a ghost. Tawain marched at the front, his body wrapped in smoke and dust, the stone spearhead tied to his belt. Each time he touched it, he felt a pulse under the surface, faint as a heartbeat. They found the first fortress at dusk. It was carved into a hill of red clay, ringed by walls so high the treetops could not see over them, but the gates hung open. Inside, everything was broken. Tools lay scattered beside collapsed huts. Fires had been stamped out in hurry. In the center stood a mound of fresh soil. The earth around it was scorched. The tribes entered cautiously, their feet silent on the soft ground. Tawain noticed bones buried half in the dirt, far larger than any human remains should be. The air was heavy, as if the place itself mourned. That night, the chiefs met inside the ruined stronghold. They spoke of victory, but no one smiled. The giants had fled south, driven beyond the horizon. The alliance would follow until every trace of them was gone. Still, an unease spread through the camp. Warriors whispered that they had not seen the giants die, only disappear. The Mengwe scouts claimed the earth itself trembled at night, as though something immense moved beneath it. Tawain sat by the remains of a wall and watched sparks rise into the cold skeet by. Each spark looked like a soul escaping the ground. In the morning, they buried their dead beside the mound. The elder who led the prayer said the giant's silence was not surrender. It was a retreat into another realm, one that could still reach through the cracks of this world, if provoked. His words lingered in the mist long after he fell quiet. The alliance broke camp and pressed on, following the river south. As they marched, the forests grew thinner, the soil drier. They crossed plains littered with stones shaped like skulls. Even the birds refused to sing. By the time they reached the next valley, the tracks were fading. The giants had scattered into small bands or vanished inwardly. The tribes celebrated with songs that sounded more like laments. Tawain wandered away from the fires and stood on a ridge overlooking the endless plain. The wind carried the scent of distant rain and something else, something metallic. He thought of the Chumash words from another shore, stories yet untold that spoke of giants sleeping beneath mountains. Perhaps this war had no end, only distance. When he closed his eyes, he imagined the giants walking into the sunset, their shadows stretching forever, their voices lost in the wind. The land would remember them, even if men forgot. Beneath his feet the ground gave a faint shudder, like a breath too deep for the world to hold. Tawang looked down at the stone spearhead, glowing faintly in the dark. It felt heavier than before, as if it now carried the weight of everything that had been buried. He wondered who would find it next. The valley of Okla lay green and wide beneath the southern sun. Corn grew tall beside the rivers, and laughter echoed from the villages. For generations, the Okla people had known only peace. They built mounds for ceremony, not for war. When a stranger arrived one morning, the guards at the edge of the settlement thought him only a wanderer. His skin was weathered, his eyes like polished stone. He said his name was Hopenla, and he came with a warning. The elders gathered beneath the shade of an oak to hear him speak. His voice was calm but cracked, as though it had carried too many storms. He said he was a messenger of the sun Fisur, and the Sun Father had shown him a vision of pale giants moving south through the forests, burning every village in their path. The elders listened politely at first. They asked where these beings came from, but Hopenla only said, "From the lands where the rivers twist like serpents, where the mountains bleed red dust." His words unsettled the children who lingered near the meeting place. The elders dismissed him, saying the Sun Father had sent no omens of war. Yet Hopenla would not leave. He walked the fields at dawn, tracing symbols in the dirt and whispering prayers no one understood. Some said he was mad, others said he was cursed. The young hunters avoided him, but the old women began to bring him food. As the weeks passed, signs began to appear. Smoke on the northern horizon, flocks of birds flying south in strange patterns, hunters returning with stories of enormous tracks pressed deep into the riverbanks. The elders still hesitated. Hopenla begged them to prepare, to gather food and hide within the earth. He led them to a place behind the sacred mound of Naniwaya, where a narrow opening led to a maze of caverns. Fresh water flowed beneath their feet, and the walls glimmered with veins of quartz that pulsed faintly in torchlight. Here, he said, they would survive when the world above turned to ash. That night a council was held. Some chiefs believed him. Others accused him of spreading fear. The debate lasted until dawn. It ended when a scout stumbled into the meeting circle, his body torn, his eyes wide with terror. He gasped that he had seen men the size of trees moving through the woods, their skin pale as bone, their hair the color of rusted iron. They carried clubs as long as canoes. Behind them, the forest burned. The elders looked to Howenla, who stood silent, tears running down his cheeks. The prophecy had found its proof. By sunset, the Okla began to dig. Families carried corn, dried meat, and water jars toward the hidden caverns. Children cried as the ground trembled in the distance. The first roar reached them like thunder rolling over the hills. Hopenla watched the smoke rise and whispered that once the giants arrived, they would not stop. He urged the people below and sealed the entrance with stones. The last thing he saw before the darkness closed was the sky turning the color of blood. In the cold tunnels, the echo of war drifted faintly through the earth. Hopenla sat beside the entrance and prayed. His voice was hoarse, his hands shaking. He asked the Sun Father not for victory, but for mercy. Above him, the valley that had once been green was swallowed by fire. The sun rose behind a curtain of smoke. The fields that once shimmered with green now burned in waves of orange. The giants came with the dawn, their silhouettes black against the fire. They moved slowly, without hurry, as if they knew the land already belonged to them. Each step shook dust from the hillsides. From the caverns below, the Okla could feel the tremors echo through stone. Mothers pressed their children close. Warriors gripped spears that would never reach high enough to matter. Above ground, the villages fell one by one. Roofs collapsed. The air filled with the scent of scorched grain. Hopenla remained at the entrance of the main passage, his eyes fixed on the thin beam of light that leaked through the cracks. The sounds outside were endless, roaring. The crash of trees, the breaking of stone walls. He whispered prayers until his voice failed. The chiefs who had mocked him now knelt beside him in silence. They could do nothing but wait for the storm to pass. The earth itself seemed to grieve. Dust drifted from the ceiling like gray snow, settling over the frightened crowd. In the deeper chambers, people began to sing to drown the thunder. The melody trembled through the tunnels, a fragile thread against the chaos above. By midday, the noise changed. It became slower, heavier, like the breathing of something tired. The giants had finished their destruction and now searched. They called out in low voices that carried through the cracks in the mound. Hopenla could feel each word inside his bones. He imagined the pale faces bending close to the earth, sniffing for the scent of the living. He told the chiefs that the time to fight had not yet come, that to move now was to die. Still, a few young warriors could not bear it. They climbed toward the opening, desperate to see their homeland one last time. None returned. When darkness fell again, the fires on the surface began to fly. Hopenla ordered the entrance sealed with seasons and fly. The last view of the world above was a sky filled with falling ash. Inside the mound, the air grew thick. Torches burned low, painting walls with red light. The elders divided what food they had, whispering that they would wait until the spirits above grew weary of the hunt. The children slept in silence, their dreams crowded with footsteps. Days passed. The noises above grew distant, then stopped. Hopenla dared to unseal a small gap in the stone. Through it, he saw nothing but darkness and drifting smoke. He felt no wind. The valley was gone. He closed the passage again and told the people that they would live now beneath the earth, as the spirits once did before creation. The chiefs accepted his word. In that moment, the Okla became something new, neither of the surface nor the underworld, but of the space between. As Hopenla sat alone at the end of the tunnel, he thought of the giants moving away, their forms fading into the burning horizon. He wondered if they had souls, or only hunger. The air around him was still warm from the fires above. He pressed his hand to the dirt wall and felt a faint vibration, as if the heart of the valley still beat somewhere far below. He whispered that he would keep watch until the people could return to the light. Outside, the stars reappeared over a land of ash, and no one remained to see them. The darkness became their new sky. In the endless quiet beneath the mound, the Okla built a world of whispers. They lined the tunnels with woven reeds to mark the paths, and used glowworms trapped in clay jars for light. Children were born who had never seen the sun. They learned to walk by the sound of dripping water, to sleep by the rhythm of distant echoes. The air was thick with the scent of damp stone and crushed roots. The giants above were only stories now, spoken softly at night, so the little ones would not forget why they lived below. Hopenla grew old watching the fires in the jars fade and rekindle. He taught the people how to find food in the caverns, mushrooms that grew on black walls, blind fish that swam in underground streams. They survived, but survival carried a cost. The songs of the old world vanished. Voices grew hoarse, laughter rare. Those who dreamed of the surface did not speak of it aloud. The few who did climb toward the sealed entrance were stopped by guards who feared that even a crack of light might invite the giants back. The earth had become both home and prison. Generations passed in this way. The names of the first chiefs became myth, their faces forgotten. Some claimed they could still hear the giants walking far above. Others said the footsteps were only memory. Hopenla died in his sleep, his final words a whisper of gratitude to the Sun Father, who had given them darkness to endure. After his death, the people called him the Guardian. They said his spirit wandered the tunnels to keep them away. But even his legend could not stop the slow hunger that crept through the tribe. Food ran low. The fish grew scarce. The mushrooms shriveled. In that time of desperation, a child named Pelitachi was born. He grew among the echoes, his eyes pale and sharp. From the moment he could walk, he asked about the world above. The elders tried to quiet him, but curiosity spread like fire. He would follow the tunnels to their deepest ends, tracing the carved walls where the ancestors had recorded their exile. One day, he found an old crack leading upward. Through it drifted a faint thread of warm air. He placed his hand over it and felt sunlight for the first time. It burned. He smiled. The people whispered that the guardian had sent a sign. When Pelitachi returned, he spoke to the council of chiefs and said the time had come to see the surface again. They laughed at him, calling him dream blind. Yet the hunger would not end, and the caverns seemed smaller every year. That night, while the tribe slept, Pelitachi climbed toward the sealed stone gate. He pressed his ear to the cold rock and listened. Beyond it, the world breathed. He could not tell if it was wind or the giants themselves, but he vowed that one day the Okla would no longer hide. He marked the entrance with the symbol of Hopenlaith's sun, rising from behind a mountain, and returned to the darkness below. The echo of his footsteps carried through the tunnels, waking those who still dared to hope. The first spark of rebellion had been lit, though no one yet knew what it would cost. Pelitachi grew taller, his shoulders narrow but firm, his eyes glimmering with the light that came from no fire. The elders said he carried the restlessness of the surface into him. He trained with the hunters, learned to throw darts, and moved silently through the tunnels. When others slept, he wandered toward the sealed passage, where the air smelled faintly of soil and rain. Every night, he listened for sounds above, but heard only the slow heartbeat of the earth. One evening, he found something strange, a cluster of mushrooms, dark as ink, growing near a spring, where no light reached. Their stems bled a milky sap that burned his fingers. He tasted a trace and felt his tongue go numb. He understood then why the elders had called them forbidden. Weeks passed, and hunger tightened its grip on the Okla. Children cried in the dark, while the council argued about rationing. Pelitachi stood before them and spoke with a voice that carried farther than the glow of their jars. He said they could no longer live like burrowing animals, that the Sun Father had not created them to hide. The chiefs reminded him that the giants still ruled the upper world, but Pelitachi answered that even the mightiest creature could bleed. They laughed at him, their teeth yellow in the dim light. Yet the laughter faltered when he held up one of the black mushrooms. He said the guardian had shown him a weapon, hidden in the earth itself. He spent 3 years perfecting it. Alone, he crushed the mushrooms into paste and smeared the residue onto fish bones, sharpened to needle points. He tested them on cave rats. The animals convulsed and died within minutes. He prayed for forgiveness, then continued. At last he fashioned small darts and a hollow reed to fire them. His aim was precise. Each dart left only a pinprick, but carried death within. The poison smelled faintly of stone and iron, like the air above. When he returned to the council, he brought a pig, caught from the upper tunnels. He drove a dart into its flank. The beast thrashed once and fell still. No one laughed this time. Pelitachi said he had already tested the weapon on the giants. He told them he had climbed the shaft and found 2 of the pale intruders sleeping near a ruined field. He struck each with a dart and watched them crumble to the ground. It was not strength that would save the Okla, he said, but cunning. The chiefs sat silent, their priest trembling between fear and hope. They asked him what he planned to do next. He answered simply that the era of hiding was over. That night, the tribe gathered near the ancient wall, where the symbol of Hopinla was carved. Pelitachi stood before it and declared that the guardian had given them the means to reclaim their world. The crowd answered with a sound that had not echoed in generations, a war cry. The caverns shook with it, and the water in the streams rippled, as though something far above had heard. The young rebel felt a chill, but did not look back. He told his people to prepare for ascent. The surface waited, and so did vengeance. The night the Okla rose from the caverns, the moon was thin as a blade. Pelitachi led the first band of hunters through the narrow shaft, where the air smelled of dust and forgotten rain. When they broke through the final layer of stone, the surface world opened like a wound. The valley lay quiet, covered in weeds that had swallowed the ruins of their old homes. No bird called, no wind moved the grass. The young rebel felt the chill of the open sky sink into his bones. It was the first time he had seen the stars. They looked like the eyes of spirits, watching to see if he would fail. He gave the signal, and the hunters fanned out through the darkness. Each carried a blowpipe, carved from bone, and a pouch of darts tipped with the black poison. They moved silently among the crumbled mounds where the giants had camped. The first pale shapes appeared near the dead river, resting among fallen stones. Even in sleep, they looked immense, their breath rumbling like thunder beneath the earth. Pelitachi motioned with 2 fingers. The hunters took their positions. A faint hiss followed, barely louder than the whisper of grass. One dart struck the throat of the nearest giant. It stirred, reached for its neck, then went still. Another rose halfway, before collapsing with a sound that shook the ground. Within moments, the camp was filled with confusion. Giants stumbled to their feet, roaring as they clutched at invisible wounds. Some tore the darts free and stared at them in disbelief, as if the insects of the night had turned against them. Pelitachi watched from the shadows, his heart hammering in rhythm with the dying cries. The poison worked faster than he had hoped. By dawn, the giants were gone. Some had fled into the forest. Others lay sprawled across the field like fallen statues. The Okla dragged their weapons away, careful not to touch the bodies. They hid among the ruins and waited for the sun. When the first light touched the hills, Pelitachi knelt in the dirt and pressed his hand against the cold skin of the nearest giant. He felt no warmth, only a strange vibration, like the echo of a heartbeat that did not know it had ended. He whispered a prayer for mercy, though he was not sure for whom. The hunters returned to the caverns before daylight broke completely. They carried no trophies, only silence. The elders gathered to hear what had happened, and when Pelitachi finished speaking, no one moved. The council finally nodded, their fear replaced by something older and sharper hope. For the first time since the exile, the people believed they might walk the surface again. That belief spread through the tunnels like wind through hollow reeds. Children touched the walls and asked what sunlight felt like. That night, Pelitachi stood alone at the mouth of the shaft. The air outside carried a faint sweetness he had never known. He looked toward the horizon, where smoke still rose from the dying camp. The wind shifted, bringing the scent of poison and ash. It brushed against his face like a hand both gentle and cold. He realized the wind itself had changed. It no longer sang the song of the giants. It sang for those who had learned to kill them. He closed his eyes, letting it move through him, and whispered that the war had only just begun. The darkness became their ally. Each evening, when the last glow of sunset faded from the horizon, the Okla hunters slipped from the hidden shafts beneath the mound. They moved like smoke, their bare feet soundless on the broken ground. The giants had abandoned their old camps and gathered near the rivers, where they believed the open water would protect them. Pelitachi watched them from the ridges, counting their fires. The pale figures huddled together, restless, glancing often into the shadows. The first taste of fear had reached them, and it grew with every silent death. The hunters carried their blowpipes slung across their backs, darts sealed in bone tubes to keep the poison fresh. When the wind rose, they crept closer. The hiss of a dart was softer than a sigh. One by one, the giants fell, twisting in confusion before the poison took hold. The Okla dragged the bodies into the underbrush, leaving no trace but the flattened grass. At dawn, the survivors would awaken to find their companions missing. They searched the forests, overturning stones, shouting into the night for answers. The only reply was the whisper of reeds bending in the wind. By the third hunt, the giants had begun to move south. They carried their wounded on makeshift sleds, their eyes wide and hollow. Pelitachi ordered his warriors to follow, but not to strike unless certain of the kill. They shadowed the enemy across valleys, scorched by the first fires of war. The land itself seemed to shrink beneath the weight of so much silence. At night, the hunters slept in shifts, their bodies pressed against the cold soil, listening for distant footsteps. Even victory had its ghosts. One evening, as the hunters prepared their darts, a young warrior hesitated. He asked Pelitachi if they had become the same as those they hunted. The rebel looked at the black mushrooms crushed between his fingers and said that survival never wore clean hands. The boy nodded, but did not smile. When the moment came, he loosed his dart and watched another giant stumble into the river, its body vanishing under the current. The water shimmered with pale foam before closing again, smooth and quiet. Weeks passed. The giants dwindled. The Okla began to walk more openly, reclaiming the fields where their ancestors had once sown grain. They rebuilt fires on the surface, though small and low. As if afraid to wake the Skistie, the poison had given them power. But power carried hunger of its own. Some warriors spoke of chasing the giants beyond the horizon, finishing what had been started. Pelitachi listened without answering. In the flicker of the flames, his eyes looked older than the stars. He knew that when the last giant fell, Something in his people would fall with it. That night, he climbed alone to the ridge overlooking the plain. The wind carried a strange sound, neither cry nor song. He realized it was the breath of the dying world below him, the echo of footsteps fading into memory. For the first time, he felt pity. He whispered to the empty fields that no war ends cleanly, that every victory leaves a shadow. Then he turned back toward the mound where the others waited. The first light of dawn already touching the sky. Morning light poured over the mound like a slow river of gold. For the first time in generations, the Oaklas stood beneath an open sky without fear. Their eyes, long used to darkness, watered in the brightness. But none turned away. Children laughed as they touched the grass that had reclaimed the ruins. The air smelled of ash and new growth. Pelitachi watched them from the crest of a low hill, where the bones of a fallen giant lay half buried. Vines had already begun to crawl across its pale ribs. The sight filled him with both pride and unease. The war was over. The giants were gone. Yet the silence they left behind felt wrong, too heavy, like a world holding its breath. The elders gathered near the river to bless the ground. They spoke the names of those lost to darkness and those who had died in the hunts. The water reflected their faces in shards of light, bending them into ghosts. Pelitachi waded in until the current reached his knees. He could feel the silt move around his feet, cool and soft. Beneath it, deeper still, the bones of the old world rested. He whispered a prayer not of victory, but of peace, though he was not sure the earth would listen. When he opened his eyes, the water had turned red with yeasties. By noon, the people began to rebuild. They used stone from the ruined fortresses of the giants, shaping each block with careful hands. Huts rose where craters had been, and smoke once again curled into the sky. The air was full of voices, laughter mixed with hammer strikes. But as night fell, the noise faded, and the valley grew still. The hunters kept watch from the ridges, their weapons ready. No one trusted the quiet. Sometimes, when the wind came from the west, it carried a faint echo low, slow like footsteps under the soil. The elders said it was only the mountains settling. Pelitachi knew better. He dreamed often of the caverns. In his sleep, he walked the tunnels where his ancestors had lived, hearing their whispers rise from the walls. They asked if the light had saved them, or simply changed their prison. When he woke, the stars were sharp and close, as if leaning down to listen. He missed the steady drip of water, the warmth of enclosed stone. Freedom had its own kind of loneliness. One evening, he found a child sitting by the giant's ribcage, tracing its curve with a stick. The boy asked if the giants had souls. Pelitachi thought for a long time before answering. He said perhaps they did once, but souls are like rivers. They can dry up when too much blood fills them. The boy nodded, not fully understanding, and ran back to the fires. Pelitachi looked toward the horizon, where the plains stretched empty and gold. He wondered if the giants who fled might still be walking there, slow and wounded, their shadows stretching over lands not yet discovered. The thought comforted him in a strange way. If they still walked, then the story was not finished, and neither was he. The land to the west was a furnace of light and sand. The few giants who survived the war drifted across it, their shadows long and thin on the dunes. They no longer spoke to one another. Their weapons had been thrown away, their armor cracked and useless. The sun burned their pale skin until it blistered, but still they walked. Some collapsed beside dry riverbeds, too tired to rise. Others disappeared into canyons where the wind howled like mourning. The earth gave them no mercy. It was as if the world itself wanted them gone. From the hills, the Okla scouts watched the retreat. Pelitaki had ordered them not to strike. There was no glory in killing what could barely stand. He told his men that silence would finish what poison had begun. The scouts returned each night with the same report. The giants were moving farther south, leaving behind only foils and strange carvings on the rocks. Symbols of circles and eyes scratched deep into the stone. Some said they were prayers. Others said they were curses. The desert swallowed them all without answer. Weeks passed. The hunters grew restless. They wanted to chase the giants, to end the story completely. Pelitachi refused. He said every war must leave something behind, a scar to remind the living what they had done. His words calmed few. Many of the younger warriors could not forget the taste of vengeance. They spoke of the missing nights when their ancestors hid in the ground, of the hunger and the fear. To them, pity was a weakness. Pelitachi listened and said nothing. In his heart, he knew that hatred once learned is hard to unteach. One evening, a sandstorm swept across the plains. When it passed, the world was changed. The dunes where the giants had marched were smooth, their tracks erased. Only one thing remained, a single hand rising from the sand, fingers stiff as stone. The hunters found it at dawn, half buried. The skin turned to gray leather by the sun. Around its wrist was a band carved from bone, etched with the same looping marks seen on the canyon walls. Pelitachi touched it and felt the faint hum of something ancient, like the echo of a language too old for breath. He ordered the site left untouched. The desert would be their grave and their monument. That night, the Okla built a small fire on a ridge overlooking the endless sea of sand. The flames bent low in the wind. No one spoke. The stars above seemed colder here, distant and sharp. Pelitachi thought of the old stories that had once been warnings and were now history. He realized that history itself was only another kind of desert, vast, merciless, and filled with bones that no one remembered. As the fire died, he whispered a final prayer for the ones who had vanished into the heat. Somewhere far beyond the dunes, a faint red glow flickered and faded. The wind carried the smell of salt, hinting at an ocean that few would ever see. The giants were gone, but the world would not forget them. The desert gave way to stone, and the stone opened into shadow. The Paiute hunters had followed the rumors of giants for many days, across dunes that shimmered like molten glass. When they reached the mouth of the canyon, the air grew cold, heavy with a strange smell of dust and rot. The ground there was scattered with broken tools, enormous bones, and footprints too deep to be washed away by rain. At the canyon's heart gaped a cave so wide that wind howled from its throat. The elders called it forbidden ground, but the younger warriors wanted to see what hid inside, to know if the old legends of man-eaters were true. At dusk they entered, carrying torches made from twisted sage. The flames trembled, throwing shapes across the rock. They found piles of refuse-gnawed bones, skulls cracked open for marrow, the marks of teeth too large to belong to any man. The deeper they went, the thicker the air became. It was there that they saw them, tall figures crouched around fires of blue flame, their hair red as rust, their eyes glowing in the dark. The creatures were leaner than the stories, but their hunger had not faded. One of them raised its head and sniffed the air. The hunters froze. The giant smiled. The first to die was a boy who had stepped too close. The sound that followed was not a roar, but a deep, throaty laugh. Arrows clattered harmlessly off stone as the Paiute fled toward the entrance. Outside, night had fallen. and the desert wind shrieked through the canyon like a warning. They escaped with few survivors. Those who returned spoke of the red-haired people, who feasted on human flesh and even their own dead. They called them the Nuwavi, but soon the name changed. Across the villages, they became known only as the Cannibal Giants. For years, the Paiute watched the cave, guarding its entrance from afar. Anyone who wandered too close vanished. Then one season, a woman found the tracks of a child leading toward the canyon and none leading back. That night, the elders gathered and decided that waiting was no longer enough. They would destroy the tribe inside once and for all. The warriors came from every valley, carrying bows, spears, and bundles of dry brush. They built a wall of wood before the cave and waited for dawn. When the sun rose, they lit the brush. Smoke poured into the cavern. From within came the sounds of movement, coughing, the thud of heavy steps. Voices shouted in the giant tongue, begging or cursing, it was hard to tell which. The warriors called out, offering mercy if the creatures would come forth and live as men, not beasts. No answer came. The flames grew higher. Then the voices ceased, replaced by a single low moan that rolled through the canyon and made the rocks tremble. By nightfall, the fire had burned itself out. What remained was silence and the bitter stench of ash. The next morning, they entered to see what the fire had done. The cave floor was blackened, littered with shapes half turned to stone. The giants were gone, buried in smoke and soot. The Paiute named the place the Cave of Hunger and swore never to enter again. Yet some say that when the wind blows from the north, a faint rumble rises from within, as if something beneath the ash still breathes, waiting for the desert to forget. The wind that swept across the Nevada plain carried the taste of dust and memory. By the time the first hunters reached the cave again, generations had passed, yet the smell of old smoke still lingered near its mouth. The Paiute called it Lovelock now, though the older ones whispered another name, one too sacred for open speech. Stories had warned that the red-haired giants would one day return, and that when they did, the world would tremble once more. The scouts who came back from the north swore they had seen pale figures moving through the dry gullies at twilight. The elders did not doubt them. Under a harvest moon, the tribes gathered. Women packed baskets of stones to hurl from the ridges. Men carved arrowheads and hardened them in fire. Children were hidden far to the south, where the hills folded around a spring. The chiefs chose a narrow canyon that led to the cave, and there they built their defense. A barrier of logs and brush stacked high. The plan was simple: drive the giants inside, seal the entrance, and burn. It was a war of necessity, not of glory. When the preparations were done, the people prayed. Some asked for victory. Others asked for forgiveness. At dawn, a tremor rolled through the valley. The first of the giants appeared, tall and thin, their skin bleached by sun and hunger. They carried crude clubs of bone and wood, their eyes hollow with the memory of cannibal feasts. The hunters loosed their arrows. The air filled with the whir of flint and the dull thud of impact. The giants roared, more from confusion than pain, and stumbled back toward the cave. For every one that fell, two more emerged from the shadows behind. The battle stretched through the day. The earth shook beneath their steps. When night came, the Paiute lit the barrier. Flames rose in waves, feeding on the dry brush. The heat was fierce enough to warp the rocks. From within, the giants cried out, not with words, but with a sound that was both human and not, a sound that pressed against the heart until it hurt to breathe. The warriors shouted that mercy waited if they would come forth and live as men. No one answered. Sparks spiraled into the dark sky, carried away by the wind. By morning, the fire had died. The entrance to the cave was black and silent. A few warriors crept forward, their faces streaked with soot. Inside, the air was thick and still. What they saw turned their triumph cold. The walls were streaked with handprints, large and deep, pressed into the stone as if the rock had softened in the heat. No bodies remained, only a layer of ash that shifted when they moved. One man swore he heard breathing beneath it, a slow, patient sound. The chiefs ordered the entrance sealed with more stone and earth, and then they left. Years later, travelers passing through the valley said that when the wind blew from the west, a low hum rose from the cave. Some believed it was only the air trapped within the stone. Others said it was the last sigh of the giants, waiting for someone to dig too deep once again. The Paiute built no markers, spoke no songs of victory. They simply called it the place where hunger ended. When the last embers died, the wind carried the smoke east across the desert. The sky turned gray, soft as old cloth, and the valley lay still. The hunters who had survived the siege stood at the cave mouth, their faces streaked with soot and fear. No one spoke. Every sound seemed too loud in the new quiet. The ground underfoot was warm, pulsing faintly, as if the fire had awakened something inside the earth, instead of killing it. The elders told the warriors to step back, to leave the ashes alone. But curiosity is stronger than command. One young man reached down with his spear and lifted a handful of gray dust. It shimmered, fine as flour, and slipped through his fingers like breath. They sealed the cave that day, piling stones until the entrance was gone. Then they built a ring of smaller fires around it, one for each life lost. The flames were weak, barely visible under the afternoon sun. A woman named Tavi sang an old morning song while the others watched in silence. Her voice trembled, breaking on the high notes, but she finished. When she stopped, the valley answered with nothing at all. Even the wind had gone still. Some of the hunters dropped their weapons and knelt in the dust. They had expected triumph. What they felt instead was emptiness. That night, the people camped beside the dry riverbed. The children were kept close, too frightened to sleep. Many claimed they heard voices drifting from the direction of the cave low, distant, calling names they did not know. The chiefs said it was only the sound of cooling rock, but their eyes betrayed them. In the dark, every spark from the fires looked like an eye watching. The elders spoke softly about the balance of hunger and mercy, how one could not be killed without wounding the other. The young warriors did not answer. They sat with their heads bowed, their hands clenched around fault stones. At dawn, they scattered the ashes of their own dead into the river. The water turned silver under the light, carrying the remains toward the mountains. As the current faded into the distance, the sound of weeping rose behind it. Tavi stopped singing long enough to whisper that the giants were not gone, only dreaming in the smoke. No one argued. It was easier to believe that than to admit that the line between men and monsters had blurred beyond repair. When they left the valley, the air smelled faintly of rain, though no clouds hung above. Years later, travelers would find small carvings, half buried in the sand faces of both human and giant. Eyes closed, mouths neither smiling nor sad. They would not know who made them. The Paiute never returned to that place. They had won a war, but lost the right to tell the story aloud. Only in the quiet before dawn, when the fire burned low, did the old ones sometimes hum a tune that carried the rhythm of slow footsteps fading into ash. Far to the east, where the plains stretched beyond sight, and the grass moves like waves on an unseen sea. The Comanche tell a story of a time before memory. It was Chief Rolling Thunder who first spoke it to the pale men, who came with notebooks and questions. They sat around his fire, while the night wind combed through the prairie. Sparks drifted upward, vanishing into stars. He said that long ago, before any tribe rode horses or carried iron, there was a race of white giants who ruled the plains. They built walls on the mountain tops and cities that shone when the sun rose, towers so tall they touched the low clouds. Their voices rolled across the valleys like storms, and their hands shaped stone as easily as clay. Rolling Thunder's eyes gleamed in the firelight. He said the giants were proud and strong, but pride grows heavier than hunger. They took land that was not theirs and forced the smaller tribes into labor. They dug deep for the red metal that bled from the earth and used it to forge ornaments and weapons. The plains trembled with their power. Yet even among the giants, there were whispers of fear. The Great Spirit watched them, waiting for the day when mercy would die in their hearts. When that day came, the wind changed. It began with a season of fire. Storms swept across the sky without rain. The earth cracked open, swallowing the towers they had built. Rolling Thunder said his ancestors saw the giants running across the horizon, their cries echoing like thunder, their faces pale with disbelief. Some tried to flee east toward the rising sun, but the spirit struck them down. The others vanished into the caves of the west, hiding from judgment. When silence returned, only their ruins remained, mounds of earth that the wind has worn smooth. The old chief's voice softened. He said his people did not rejoice in the fall of the giants, for they had learned from them both greatness and arrogance. Compared to them, he murmured, the white men of today are but children. The men who recorded his words smiled politely, thinking them myth. But when the fire burned low, one of them asked if any of the giants survived. Rolling Thunder pointed toward the dark hills and said, they do not die easily. The earth forgets their names, but not their footsteps. The night grew quiet after that. Coyotes called from far off, their cries rising and falling with the wind. The men packed their notebooks, but the old chief stayed by the fire, staring into the coals. He saw shapes in them, faces too large for the flames, eyes that glimmered with something between sorrow and rage. When the last ember dimmed, he whispered a prayer for balance. That pride never again would grow taller than mercy. Then he looked to the horizon, where the first light of morning touched the mounds, and thought he saw one move. The red canyons of the southwest held their own kind of silence, the kind that listens rather than sleeps. When night came, the wind moved through the stone arches and made them sag. The elders of the Navajo gathered around small fires at the edge of the mesas, their faces lit by flame and memory. One of them, a woman with hair silver as moonlight, told the children about the Starake. She said they were not born of the earth, but descended from the sky in a blaze of light. Their skin glowed faintly, their eyes like molten gold. They called themselves the Regal Ones and demanded obedience from every tribe that lived beneath the red cliffs. The Starake built cities deep inside the mountains. From those caverns they mined shining stones that hummed with the voice of thunder. Men were forced to dig for them, chained to walls of light that never dimmed. The giants rewarded loyalty with strange gifts, tools that moved without hands, fire that did not burn. Some believed these gifts were blessings. Others said they were shackles disguised as miracles. The woman's voice grew softer as she spoke. She said the Starake did not age. They walked among storms, as if the sky itself bowed to them. and when they looked upon a man, he felt both awe and despair, because they reminded him of what he could never be. One season, the storms failed to come. The mines fell silent. The Starake grew restless and angry. They blamed the people for losing faith and turned the lights of the caverns into weapons. Villages vanished overnight, swallowed by sudden fire. Those who survived fled into the deserts, carrying only fragments of songs that told of rebellion. The earth, it is said, finally rose to defend them. The mountains shook, burying the shining cities under a rain of stone. When the dust settled, the giants were gone, their radiance buried beneath miles of rock. The storyteller paused then, staring into the flames. Some say they returned to the sky, she whispered. Others say they still walk in the deep places, waiting for the world to forget. The children leaned closer, their faces wide with fear and wonder. The fire crackled, sending sparks drifting upward like tiny stars trying to find their way home. Later that night, one of the younger men asked her if the Starake were truly gods. She smiled sadly and said no. They were only men who had forgotten how to be small. When the wind swept through the canyon again, it carried a sound like distant chanting. The man looked toward the dark ridges and thought he saw faint lights moving beneath the stone, steady and patient, like eyes opening after a long dream. The coastal air of old Peru was thick with salt and legend. When the conquistadors arrived, they found the local people whispering about a race of giants that had come from the sea long before memory began. The chronicler, Pedro de Leon, wrote the words carefully in his journal, each letter trembling with disbelief. He said the Manta elders described ships woven from reeds, vast as fortresses, carrying beings whose knees alone reached the height of ordinary men. These strangers landed under a moon so large it seemed to sink into the ocean. They walked inland without speaking, their eyes wide, their hunger greater than any storm. The Manta told him that the giants took nothing slowly. They built crude dwellings from stone, towering arches that dwarfed the palm trees, and they consumed everything: fish, fruit, even the bark from the trees. When the food was gone, they turned to darker appetites. Villages vanished overnight. The elders said the earth itself recoiled from them, the waves dragging their shadows across the sand. Pedro de Leon tried to hide the shaking of his hand as he wrote. He had seen ruins that might once have been those dwellings, stones blackened as if by fire, carved with symbols that no one alive could read. One night, he sat beside an old woman who claimed to be the last descendant of those who survived. She told him that the sky grew jealous of the giants' arrogance. Lightning struck their towers, splitting them open. From the mountains came a voice like thunder that rolled across the coast. The giants raised their arms as if to catch the sound, but the light swallowed them. The next morning, the beach was covered with ash and foils half fused into glass. The woman said the sea took the rest, pulling their spirits back to wherever they had come from. Pedro de Leon wrote that some of the sailors laughed at her story. They said the bones were those of whales. Yet at night, when the tide receded, he walked along the shore and found prints in the sand too large for any beast. He followed them until they disappeared into the waves. In that moment, the ocean seemed alive, breathing with slow, heavy sighs. He closed his journal and crossed himself, whispering that some histories are not meant to be proven, only remembered. Years later, his manuscript gathered dust in a monastery, its pages spotted with salt. But the people along the coast still tell the story when storms rise from the west. They say the thunder is not weather, but the heartbeat of the giants beneath the waves, waiting for the arrogance of men to call them back. When the wind howls through the canyons of the Andes, it carries faint laughter, a sound that chills even those who no longer believe. The wind off the Pacific carried the scent of salt and sage when the workers began digging. It was early summer, 1919, and the hills north of Santa Monica were quite quiet, except for the scrape of shovels. 3 men from the small settlement of Malibu had been hired to build a powder magazine for the ranch nearby. They worked by the tide's rhythm, sweating under the pale sky. When the first shovel struck something hard, the sound echoed strangely across the beach, metallic, hollow, almost like a bell buried beneath stone. The foreman thought it was driftwood, but the second strike sent a vibration through the sand that made every man stop. They cleared the area with their hands. The earth fell away in clumps until a long shape emerged, smooth and pale as ivory. It was a skull, enormous, half buried in the gravel bank. For a moment, none of them spoke. Then one of the men began to laugh softly, the nervous kind of laugh that comes when the world stops making sense. Beneath the skull, the outline of a ribcage curved through the sand, too vast to belong to any creature known to the coast. When they finally stepped back, the shape of a man took form, long limbs, broad chest, teeth perfectly preserved in 2 even rows. News traveled quickly. By evening, a crowd had gathered near the site. Farmers, fishermen, even a few travelers from Los Angeles stood staring down at the uncovered bones. The local newspaper sent a photographer, who set his tripod trembling in the wind. The flash revealed the bones gleaming like bleached coral. Someone said it was an ancient burial ground. Others whispered that it was proof of the old stories, the race of giants who had walked the coast before ships ever came from across the sea. The foreman tried to cover the skeleton again, but the crowd refused to leave. When night fell, the tide crept closer. The waves hissed as if warning them away. An elder from the nearby Chumash village arrived, his face carved with lines of salt and time. He told them to stop, to let the dead rest. "This land remembers what it buries," he said, his voice shaking. "You dig too deep, and the stories wake. But curiosity is louder than caution." The next morning, the men returned with more tools, intent on uncovering the rest. They found not one skeleton, but many, 14 by their count, some taller than 8 feet. Their skulls lined neatly in a row, as if waiting for judgment. The papers printed the story 2 days later under a headline about the discovery of a lost race. The article sat between a weather report and gossip about a preacher's divorce. No one seemed to realize what it meant. By the end of the week, the bones were gone, collected, they said, by a university team. The site was filled in, the beach smoothed over. Years passed. Houses rose where the giants once lay. But at low tide, when the wind cuts sharp and the waves retreat, people say you can still see impressions in the sand, long and deep, like the ghosts of footsteps too heavy to belong to men. The Sunday edition of The Call hit the streets of San Francisco with the usual noise of headlines and street hawkers. Hidden between reports of elections, weather, and divorce scandals was a column that made the typesetters pause. It spoke of a discovery near Santa Monica burial site, containing 14 skeletons, each far taller than any known man. The article was brief, matter-of-fact, as if describing a storm or a lost ship. Yet the wording carried unease. "Remains of a giant race," it read, "found in a sandbank north of Malibu." For the readers of the city, it was a curiosity. For those who knew the coast, it was a whisper from the deep past returning to life. In the newsroom, editor Charles Hewitt reread the dispatch 3 times. He had covered earthquakes, fires, and murder trials. But nothing felt quite like this. The story had come from a single telegraph wire, sent by a local correspondent. There were no photographs, only sketches of elongated skulls and crude drawings of stone mortars. The writer claimed that the smallest skeleton measured 7 feet in height, the largest more than 8. Hewitt leaned back in his chair, listening to the rain against the window, and wondered what kind of world his paper had just stepped into. By midday, the city buzzed. Coffeehouse talk turned to ancient civilizations, to Bible verses about fallen angels and myths of Titans. The museum curator down on Market Street dismissed it all as frontier fancy. Yet even he sent an assistant to ask if any of the bones might be procured for study. Within a week, the follow-up story came from another paper, the Lompoc Journal. Its front page echoed the same discovery, describing how campers near Malibu had unearthed skulls and stone utensils beside the skeletons. The two articles together formed something larger than rumor. Then the silence began. The bones were said to have been taken to a university for examination, but no report ever followed. The beach was closed off, under the guise of safety. The site filled and leveled. Those who had seen the remains firsthand received polite letters, urging them not to speak until further confirmation. Hewitt tried to print a second article, but found the typeset galleys pulled before they reached the press. The city had decided that some stories were better forgotten. At night, when the fog rolled over the bay, he dreamed of that beach. In the dream, the tide receded, revealing not 14 but hundreds of skeletons lying side by side, their skulls gleaming like lanterns under the moon. They were smiling, as if amused by the living's attempt to bury them again. He would wake to the sound of the foghorn and the slow, steady beat of rain, wondering if somewhere beneath the sand, those bones still waited, patient and untouched, for the next curious hand. Winter lingered over the Ohio Valley when the two men from Miamisburg began to dig. Their shovels struck frozen earth, dull thuds echoing off the bare trees. They were looking for gravel to shore a riverbank, not history. Near noon, a sharp clang rang out, metal on something solid, but not stone. They cleared the frost with numb hands, revealing the curve of a skull buried in clay. The air around it felt warmer, almost humming. When they unearthed the full form, they stood back in awe. The skeleton sat upright, knees drawn to its chest, arms resting across them, like a guardian in waiting. When measured against the shovel handle, the thing must have stood more than 8 feet in life. Its bones gleamed like ivory under the gray sky word spread through the valley. By evening, farmers and townsfolk crowded the site, their breath steaming in the cold. The local paper sent a reporter who scribbled notes while his hands shook. He wrote that the skull drooped forward as though bowed in grief, and the jawbone alone could fit around a man's head. Near the ribs, they found shards of stone shaped like arrowheads, though larger than any known weapon. Some called it the remains of a forgotten chief. Others whispered that it was proof of the mound builders, a mysterious race long spoken of by the tribes. The more the crowd stared, the quieter it by. The bones were moved to a nearby barn for safety. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting long shadows across the walls. One of the diggers swore that when he touched the skull, it vibrated faintly, as if remembering thunder. A preacher arrived, declaring the find a sign of biblical times, the very Nephilim of old. Scholars from Cincinnati dismissed him, but requested the skeleton for study. Within days, the remains vanished into a covered wagon driven west. No one saw them again. The newspaper printed its article under the headline, "Full description of the skeleton, found at Miamisburg, promising follow-up research that never came. Decades later, children played near the same hill where the bones had been found. The mound was still there, scarred by frost and time. Some nights, when the air turned heavy before snow, lights were said to move across its surface, slow and red, like embers carried by unseen hands. The elders said it was only lantern glow from the farms, but the children whispered that the giant was still sitting there beneath the soil, waiting for someone to finish his story. In the archives of the county courthouse, the yellowed clipping remains faded ink, describing an impossible man, measured by tumbling fingers. No one knows where the skeleton went, only that it was taken by those who promised to understand. The silence that followed felt deliberate. In the quiet of the valley, between the rustle of dead leaves, one can still imagine the ground shifting, a low creak of frozen clay, as if something below is stretching its long limbs. The Arizona sun had no mercy that summer. It baked the ground until the stones cracked and the air shimmered above the dry creek beds. Near the small settlement of Prescott, a rancher named Corbin set out to dig a new well along the edge of Sycamore Creek. The shovel struck hard soil, then something that rang like bone beneath iron. He knelt, scraping at the dirt until pale shapes emerged from the dust. At first, he thought they were the remains of an animal, but as the hole widened, the truth revealed itself in fragments: an arm longer than his whole body, ribs as thick as fence posts, a skull that could have worn a saddle as a crown. By nightfall, neighbors had gathered with lanterns. Their yellow light trembled across the pit, illuminating a skeleton stretched over 8 feet long. The jaw hung open as if mid-breath, the teeth worn smooth but unbroken. Beside it lay stone pestles, mortars, and tools blackened by time. Someone whispered that the ground here had once been holy to tribes long gone. Another muttered that the bones belonged to the same race unearthed in California years before, the lost giants who had walked before the flood. Corbin said little. He only stared into the empty sockets, thinking he saw a flicker of red deep inside. The local paper, the Prescott Journal-Miner, printed the story under the headline, "Ancient Burying Ground Uncovered." It spoke of a second find on Walnut Creek, not far from the first. Farmers read it over breakfast, shaking their heads, calling it myth. Yet within days, strangers arrived, men with notebooks and measuring rods, claiming to be from a museum in the north. They cataloged every fragment, every stone, before loading the bones into crates. Corbin asked when they'd return them. The leader smiled thinly and said the specimens would receive proper study. No report ever came. Weeks later, storms rolled through the desert, washing the dig site clean. Where the pit had been, only a shallow depression remained, filled with muddy water. Corbin dreamed of it often. In those dreams, the pool reflected not the stars, but a face too large to be human, watching him with a quiet patience. When he woke, he swore he could still taste dust in his mouth. By autumn, whispers spread through the town. Miners claimed to hear heavy footsteps at night, far out near Sycamore Creek, echoing against the canyon walls. One man said he saw a tall figure standing motionless in the lightning flashes during a storm, its eyes glowing faintly like coal. None dared investigate. They simply nailed their doors shut and prayed until dawn. Years later, the story of the Prescott discovery faded like smoke. The desert swallowed its secrets, the bones lost to time, or to those who preferred silence. But sometimes, when thunder crawls across the sky, the people of Prescott still glance toward the barren hills and remember the night the earth opened its mouth and spoke in bones. Rain fell in steady sheets over the green labyrinth of the Ecuadorian jungle. Mud clung to boots, and the air hummed with insects. At a remote dig site near the border of Peru, British archaeologist Russell Demon brushed soil from a shape that had no business being so large. The bones lay in neat alignment, longer than the trench itself. When the skull surfaced, its curve mirrored that of a man, but stretched impossibly wide. Demon measured again, certain of a mistake. Yet the numbers never changed. The skeleton before him stood close to 8 feet tall, the joints thick and smooth, the bones unmarked by disease. It was a body built for a different world. The team uncovered 2 more within days, each buried with care, wrapped in layers of woven cloth that had fused with the earth. The artifacts around them were delicate ceramic bowls, painted stones, fragments of gold shaped into spirals. None spoke of deformity or accident. Whoever these people were, they had been honored. Damon sat beneath the canopy that night, listening to the rain beat against the tents. His assistant asked if this could be gigantism, a trick of nature. Damon shook his head. Not all 3, he said, and not this perfect. News of the discovery reached Europe before the expedition had even left the jungle. Newspapers printed cautious headlines about exceptionally tall individuals. Academics rolled their eyes, but read every word. The funding body in Germany requested more data, more caution, more proof. Demon complied, sending photographs, measurements, even DNA samples packed in ice. Weeks passed with no reply. When the radio finally crackled to life, the voice on the other end told him to suspend further excavation until proper verification could be arranged. The signal faded before he could ask who had sent it. As supplies dwindled, Damon's team packed the remains into wooden crates for transport. The rain never stopped. On their final night, he returned to the open pit one last time. Lightning revealed the outline of another form, half buried beneath roots, larger than the rest. He felt a pull to uncover it, but reason held him back. The earth was closing over it, even as he watched. He whispered an apology to whatever slept there and turned away. Months later, fragments of the skeletons arrived in Berlin for study. The official report spoke of abnormal height within human variation. No mention of the perfect bones, the preserved lungs, or the spiral markings carved into the ribs. Damon resigned quietly soon after. Friends said he grew paranoid, claiming someone had erased portions of his notes. He kept a single photograph locked in his desk, a hand resting beside a femur that dwarfed it. Beneath the image he had written only 3 words. They were healthy. In the jungle, the rain kept falling. The locals avoided the site, saying the ground still breathed. Travelers who camped nearby swore they heard muffled drumming deep below, as if something immense were knocking to be remembered. Russell Demon's office smelled of dust and rain. The crates from Ecuador had been gone for months, shipped to the university archives under orders marked confidential. Each week, he checked for updates, and each week, the reply was the same: no comment. The journals that once begged for his field reports now ignored his letters. One morning, he arrived to find his name missing from the department door. When he asked the dean, the man smiled thinly and said the funding for that particular project had been redirected. Behind him, a secretary shredded a stack of papers bearing Demon's handwriting. At night, he returned to his apartment and replayed the recordings from the jungle. The static-laced voice of his assistant came through, counting measurements, describing the unbroken joints, the massive lung cavities. The sound of rain filled the gaps like a heartbeat. He knew those tapes would soon disappear too. The university had requested all documentation for archiving. It was the same phrase used when something was being erased politely. He began hiding copies in sealed envelopes, mailing them to colleagues he half trusted. Some wrote back to say they had received nothing. Others never answered at all. He visited the museum basement where the crates had been stored. The guard hesitated but finally let him in. The room smelled of formaldehyde and old wood. Rows of boxes stretched into shadow. Damon found the spot where his specimens had been placed. The labels were gone. In their place sat crates stamped with meaningless numbers. He pried one open. Inside lay only rocks, wrapped in decaying cloth. The weight of the loss hit him harder than any discovery ever had. Soon after, he began to notice the watchers. A black car idled across the street from his flat each evening. The phone would ring once and fall silent when he lifted it. Friends urged him to rest, to let the matter go. But he couldn't. He remembered the perfection of the bones, the way they seemed to hum when touched, as if carrying a memory too large for words. He started writing a manuscript titled The Tall Ones, chronicling every detail he could recall. He sent the first draft to a small academic press. A week later, the editor called to apologize. The submission had been misplaced during review. No copy remained. Years passed. Damon faded from the public record, his work mentioned only in footnotes and rumor. Yet among a circle of field archaeologists, whispers persisted about a lost discovery that could have redrawn the map of human history. Some claimed to have seen photographs of the skeletons in private collections. Others said the bones had been ground to powder for study, their measurements never logged. In the archives of the university, a single entry remained: Project 701. Status: pending analysis. No one could say what the numbers meant. On his final evening, Damon sat by the window listening to the rain, the same rhythm he had heard in the jungle. He thought of the bones still sleeping under the green canopy, untouched by science or secrecy. He smiled faintly, knowing the earth would guard its secrets better than any institution ever could. When the storm thundered outside, it sounded almost like applause. In the quiet halls of old universities, drawers clicked shut for the last time. Curators sealed ledgers. Archivists signed forms they did not read. And somewhere beneath the hum of fluorescent lights, history was quietly rearranged. Boxy species once labeled anomalous finds disappeared overnight. Photographs of oversized skulls were refiled under irrelevant categories: animal remains, misidentified fossils, hoaxes. The young assistants who noticed were told not to ask questions if they wanted to keep their positions. One woman, a graduate intern named Clara, made the mistake of asking twice. By the end of the week, her security pass no longer opened any door. She took what she could before leaving: a photograph stamped Ecuador, a carbon sheet of bone measurements, and a letter addressed to someone named Damon. The letter bore no signature, only a single typed line: "They will not allow what was seen to be known." Clara carried the papers home and hid them between the walls of her apartment. That night, she dreamed of endless shelves filled with empty boxes, each humming faintly, as if the contents still remembered being real. Across the ocean, similar vanishings occurred. In Berlin, a curator awoke to find the museum basement flooded. The crates containing skeletal fragments had dissolved in the water like sugar. In Washington, a reporter who had pursued the story of prehistoric giants received a call warning that further curiosity might be unhealthy for his career. His next article was about a fishing competition. The pattern stretched across continent, every clue erased, every question silenced. Yet the silence itself grew louder, an echo impossible to bury. Years later, Clara's photograph surfaced in an online forum devoted to lost anthropology. The image showed a gloved hand beside a massive femur. The background was jungle green. Within hours, the post vanished, the account deleted. But copies lingered, shared and reshared until no one could tell which was original. The comments beneath ranged from wonder to ridicule. Some insisted the photo was genuine, others mocked it as another myth chasing believers. Between them lay the same emptiness that always follows truth too large to fit within belief. In the archives that survived, researchers sometimes find marginal notes, half sentences scrawled in pencil, too large for human scale. Anatomy and testes, removed under directive. The handwriting changes, but the caution does not. It is as if generations of scholars have been whispering through the dust, warning those who might uncover the same thing again. Some nights, when storms roll over the Atlantic, lights flicker in the storage vaults of forgotten museums. Guards report the sound of boxes shifting, paper rustling as though restless. They say the air grows heavy, almost expectant. Perhaps the earth wants its dead remembered. Or perhaps the stories themselves refuse to stay buried. Somewhere in that darkness, among the sealed cabinets and fading labels, truth waits patiently, knowing that curiosity is the one hunger mankind can never starve. The mountains of Kandahar rose like broken teeth against the sky. In that pale heat, sound traveled strange. Every echo lingered too long. Every silence felt watched. The platoon moved carefully along the ridge, their boots sinking into dust the color of ash. They were looking for missing men. A patrol that had vanished during a routine sweep. The radio crackled with static, then died. The captain ordered a halt. Somewhere ahead, the wind carried a faint metallic scent, sharp and unfamiliar. Corporal Lasker was the first to see the shape. At first, he thought it was a boulder lodged in the ravine below. But when the light shifted, it issued. The figure stood taller than any man, its limbs thick and raw, its hair the color of old blood. It turned its head toward them with a slow, deliberate motion. Then it charged. The mountain erupted in chaos, shouts, gunfire, dust. When the noise finally stopped, the creature lay sprawled across the rocks. Its body was massive, its skin pale beneath the sun, and its eyes still open, staring at nothing. The men circled it in disbelief. Sergeant Quinn knelt beside the body, measuring the hand against his own. The fingers were twice his length, the nails chipped like stone. There was no smell of rot, only the dry sweetness of desert air. One of the medics muttered that this thing was not human. Lasker radioed for extraction, but the signal returned garbled, as if the air itself refused to carry the words. Within hours, helicopters arrived. The soldiers were ordered to stand back, while men in unmarked uniforms sealed the remains in the canvas shroud. No photographs, no notes, just a signature on a report that would never be filed. That night, back at the base, the survivors sat in silence. Their commanding officer entered the tent with two men from intelligence. They asked the same questions over and over. What did you see? How tall? How many teeth? Any sign of more? The answers were written down, then collected and burned. Each soldier was told the incident was classified. They would speak of it to no one. Lasker lay awake long after lights out, staring at the canvas roof. As the wind moaned through the wire fence, he could still hear the footsteps, slow and heavy, echoing through the ravine long after the creature had fallen. Weeks later, another patrol passed the same route. They found nothing, no blood, no prints, not even disturbed earth. Only a strange depression in the sand shaped like a man's outline, far too large for any soldier. Officially, The story became a rumor, a desert ghost born from exhaustion and heat. But among the troops, whispers spread. Some said the body had been flown out under cover of night to an airfield beyond the border. Others claimed it was buried in a vault, with the same missing evidence from wars long forgotten. When Lasker finally returned home, he tried to leave it behind. Yet every time he closed his eyes, he saw that face again, too human to be an animal, too ancient to be a man. He wrote a report of his own, hidden away in a drawer. On the last page, he wrote a single line. The legends never ended. They just changed their battlefield. The museum basement was colder than the street above. Rows of wooden crates stood in the half-light, their labels yellow with dust. Most bore dates and accession numbers, tidy marks of catalogued history. But one sat apart, chained to the wall, its surface stained darker than the rest. The word Lovelock was stenciled across the lid in faded black. The curator, Mara Whitfield, found it while preparing for renovations. She checked the registry twice. The crate had no entry, no record of origin, no listed contents. She hesitated before prying loose the first nail. The sound echoed through the empty corridors, like a question too long unasked. Inside, layers of burlap covered something heavy. The cloth smelled of salt and smoke. She pulled it back slowly, her breath fogging in the chill air. What lay beneath made her step away. A rib cage, immense and intact, rested within the straw. The skull, though cracked, was unmistakably human in shape, yet wrong in sessile. Its teeth white and even in two perfect rows. A faint red hue lingered in the hair still clinging to the bone. Mara stood trembling. Her rational mind reached for explanations. Hoax, mislabeled replica, elaborate prop. But none fit. She had seen casts, reconstructions, forgeries. This was none of them. She covered it again and locked the room, but sleep refused to come that night. The image burned behind her eyes. The next morning, she returned with a flashlight. The air felt different, heavier. The lock on the crate hung open, though she was certain she had turned it. The lid sat slightly askew. She crouched, shining the beam across the floor. The layer of dust that had settled for decades now bore a single mark-long trail, leading from the crate to the corner wall, where it ended abruptly. No footprints, no debris, just that groove. By evening, she called the head of the museum. He told her to seal the crate immediately and forget what she had seen. Some exhibits, he said, exist for the sake of containment. His voice held a weight that silenced further questions. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that the crate wasn't meant for storage, but imprisonment. That night, she heard movement below her office floor, slow scraping, like wood shifting against stones. The lights flickered once, twice, then steadied. She did not go down to check. Weeks later, the basement was cleared for construction. Workers reported that one crate was missing. The supervisor assumed a mix-up in records. When Mara inspected the space, she found only a faint outline on the floor where it had rested. The wall nearby bore fresh cracks, thin and curling like veins. The air smelled faintly of dust and decay. She pressed her palm against the surface and felt a pulse, not strong, but steady. That night, she resigned without explanation. The museum reopened months later, with new displays and brighter lights. But the guards on night shift whispered about footsteps echoing in the closed halls, about the faint scent of smoke that drifted through the vents after midnight. No one spoke the word Lovelock aloud. The past had reclaimed one of its own. Rain drummed against the windows of the archive, steady as breath. The world outside was only shadow and thunder, but inside, The lamplight fell over boxes of yellowed paper, maps and bones catalogued without names. I sat at the long wooden table reading fragments, gathered from every age, the Chumash warnings, the Delaware Wars, the Paiute fires, the reports from Ohio and Arizona, the sealed crates of Lovelock. Each line felt like a pulse, a rhythm linking centuries. The farther I read, the clearer it became that these stories were not separate at all. They were the same tale retold, by different mouths, each remembering a war between men and something too much like them to forget. Outside, lightning flared, casting the room in white. The skeleton displayed in the corner seemed to shift under the flash. Its skull was smooth, its teeth arranged in twin rows, its empty sockets full of quiet accusation. I had been taught to dismiss such things, to trust data. Not myth, but the documents spread before me said otherwise. They spoke of the deliberate silence, of kills hidden, of records rewritten. Somewhere along the way, we decided that the giants could not exist. And by deciding it, we buried them a second time. I wondered if the first burial had been mercy and the second fear. The clock on the wall ticked louder than before. Water leaked from the ceiling, running down the spines of forgotten ledgers. I thought of Hopenla praying in darkness, of Pelitachi's poisoned darts, of the hunters who turned survival into legend. Every age had its giants, and every age learned to kill them. Perhaps that is what progress means, to forget the size of what once frightened us. I reached for the last page of the last report, a single line scrawled in ink nearly faded. They were not monsters, only mirrors. The handwriting was demons. Thunder rolled again, shaking the shelves. For a moment, I thought I heard footsteps in the corridor, slow, deliberate, far too heavy for the floorboards. The lamp flickered. In its brief darkness, the reflection in the window seemed taller than my own, standing just behind my shoulder. I did not turn. I only whispered an apology to the bones, to the stories, to whatever waited in the soil for acknowledgement. The reflection stayed still, listening. When I finally looked up, the storm had softened to rain. The archive felt lighter, as if a long breath had been released. I packed the papers, knowing they would never see publication, that they would join the quiet chorus of hidden truths. As I locked the door, a faint tremor rippled through the floor, subtle but certain, the earth shifting, remembering. Somewhere deep below, a voice older than language murmured back into sleep. Maybe it was relief. Maybe it was forgiveness. Or maybe it was a reminder that history's greatest giants were never buried in the ground at all. They were buried in us.